Welcome to Unlocked, the home of common sense that speaks Britain's language. We have a special commemorative episode, Remembrance Unlocked, to discuss the totemic place Remembrance Sunday has in our nation's heart and why we believe this unifying moment should not become a casualty of the COVID lockdown. 11 days ago, when Boris Johnson announced that this year's Cenotaph March Past would be cancelled and urged veterans and the public alike to stay at home on Remembrance Sunday, Unlocked slammed the decision as absolutely heartbreaking and completely out of touch with the public mood. Well, perhaps Number 10 took notice, as yesterday the Prime Minister reversed that decision. Here to discuss all of this, but above all, to honour the memories of the fallen, we have two very special guests. First, Colonel Richard Kemp, a commander of the Order of the British Empire, who has spent most of his life fighting terrorism and insurgency, commanding British troops on the front line of some of the world's toughest hotspots, including Afghanistan, Iraq, the Balkans, and Northern Ireland. Also joining us, we have Laurence Fox, leader of the recently formed Reclaim Party, who has this week launched a campaign to encourage the British public to honour Remembrance Sunday and share their poppy stories. First, Colonel Kemp, may I thank you for your service. And as it appears, the government has done a U-turn on Remembrance Sunday. Can you please clarify what is the current situation for those who would like to mark the day this Sunday?
Well, thank you very much. You don't need to thank me for my service. I spent 30 years in the army, and it was a real pleasure and an honour to be able to serve alongside the men and women that put themselves forward to fight for this country. And it's not really thanks needed. Secondly, I'd like to pay compliment to Unlocked for the stand you took. I think you've spearheaded this campaign, which has led the government to turn around and to admit and to accept that proper remembrance ceremonies are needed. So I think that is something that you should take great credit for. And certainly I, and I'm sure many other veterans will be grateful for the stand you made. It's so important that we remember our fallen on Remembrance Sunday and Armistice Day on the 11th, because they gave so much to us. They gave more than you or I could give, or even the greatest entrepreneur, the most brilliant scientist, the greatest philanthropist. They gave everything they ever had or would ever had. They gave their life for the country. And it's right that we should come together as best we can, even in these times, to remember them.
What about some of the specifics about what will be and what won't be allowed on Remembrance Sunday itself?
Well, it's understandable. Whatever one thinks about the lockdown, whatever one thinks about the coronavirus precautions, and we're not here or anything to discuss those, whatever one thinks of that, given that that is the situation and that is now going to become the law very soon, the lockdown, the rules, it's understandable that there would be a need to have a modified version of Remembrance this year. But my understanding is it's actually been quite severely constrained. Even down, when you think about it, even down to government guidance saying how long a hymn can be that's sung, just a couple of minutes or something like that. And you can have a very tiny number of people. I think that's better than to ban it altogether and to cancel it altogether. I think it's really important that we have those, and that they're also seen by people on the media, via the media. And so I would hope there's a maximum media coverage of these events around the country. But it is heavily constrained, and a lot of people will not be able to take part in remembrance ceremonies as they normally like to do. And those people, I think, can either stay at home and simply maybe observe a minute or 2 minutes silence on Sunday at 11 o'clock in their own private remembrance, or even come out onto the doorstep. And I think that would be a pretty a significant thing to do. And it's important not just that we do remember, but it's important that we are seen to remember. Why is that? Because we do owe these people such a lot. Their families, and okay, there's many of them and many of their families have died, because most of our people are from the First and Second World War, but there are still, of course, families of soldiers who were killed in conflicts like the Falklands, Northern Ireland, Afghanistan, and Iraq, they're still there. It's important that they see this collective demonstration of remembrance. And also it's important, I think, for members of the armed forces to see that the sacrifices they may be called upon to make, let's hope they won't be, but they might be, it's part of the deal, that will be respected and remembered and admired by the country. It's an important sign of encouragement, I believe.
You wrote a heart-stirring piece in The Express this week. A longer version of that is on your website, richardkemp.com. And it tells of a personal tale, doesn't it, of the importance of Remembrance Sunday for you because of what happened to a relative in the First World War.
Many people in this country, many people in this country have forebears who fought and died in the world wars. I have my great uncle who was killed at Passchendaele pretty much this week in 1917, 3 weeks after arriving at the front line from the UK, after he twisted the system to get himself out there and to go and fight for the country. He was in a reserved occupation at the time, which meant he couldn't fight. So he managed to manipulate the system to get himself out. And he died in the mud with hundreds and indeed thousands of others. In the Second World War, another relation of mine, my cousin, who was serving in the Merchant Navy, he was sunk by a German U-boat in the Atlantic in 1943. So I particularly remember those two relations of mine at this time of year. But I think for soldiers, for many soldiers and former soldiers in particular, perhaps, we also have, I think, a unique way of looking at this, because we have the misfortune of knowing many people who were killed in action personally. And, you know, I think of young soldiers who fought in Northern Ireland, people like Private Bertram, Private Davis, Private Nick Peacock, who fought and were killed. And I was serving in the same battalion as them. And we will inevitably think of them. People like Corporal Darren Bonner, who died in Afghanistan, who I served alongside. And even I didn't know this man, but someone that I always think of on Remembrance Sunday is Captain Robert Nairac, who was killed in 1977 by the IRA, and his remains still haven't been recovered. They refuse even today to say where he is. And I think that extra dimension that people who have served have, and the background of people who've served, mean that we, I think, above most people, we really do find a great significance in Remembrance Sunday. And we, I think, above most people, abhor conflict because we've experienced conflict firsthand. And we certainly don't glorify war through remembrance. We pay respect and pay our tribute to those people who gave so much for us and for the country.
Just before I move on to Laurence Fox, a really powerful message you put across was, the message to us as veterans is clear: do not let COVID kill Remembrance Sunday.
In 1919, over 100 years ago, we had the worst pandemic, if you want to call it that, that's ever affected this country, I think, certainly since the plague. And 228,000 British people died in that pandemic that lasted from 1918 to 1919. The first remembrance event we ever held of the type we hold today was held in the midst of that pandemic. That didn't stop them from doing so. The Second World War, when Hitler was bombing London, bombing cities around the country, people were dying in war, and our homes and livelihoods were under threat from violence. That didn't stop them remembering. It merely made them shift it to a Sunday. It was normally on the 11th. It was shifted to the nearest Sunday in order to avoid impact on war production. So the example that they set to us, people in 1919, people in the Second World War, I think is an example we should follow, and we should not allow ourselves to be bowed and defeated by this dreadful virus. Obviously, we need to make sure that people don't catch the virus because of attending remembrance event. That's self-evident. But I am confident that in events such as the ones that we are looking at conducting on Remembrance Sunday, they're orderly, they're well organized, they're well planned. They're not demonstrations, riots, they're well planned events. They can easily be held safely on a large scale with social distancing.
Colonel Kemp, thank you. Please stick around. I'd like to involve you in the conversation a bit later. Just had a message come in on Facebook from Nikki, just saying, Colonel Kemp, a great point, and surely this is an opportunity for the great British public to demonstrate that they are reasonable and responsible, contrary to how the mainstream media and the government sees us. We can turn out on Sunday and do the right thing without risking or endangering anybody. And let us give us that trust. Let us demonstrate the passion. When you read out the names of the fallen there, I'm sure a lot of people listening would concur. With I lost relatives in the Second World War, and this isn't about politics. It's about honouring the fallen and remembering their names. And I, for one, cannot stand the way this gets politicised by the opponents of it. And more to the point, for God's sake, if Adolf Hitler couldn't stop Remembrance Day, why should COVID-19? Anyway, moving swiftly onwards now. Hang on a sec. We've got some breaking news. Just been an announcement, guys. So David Banks, who's the head of Veterans for Britain, he was on the last episode of Unlocked when we called for Remembrance Sunday to carry on. He's just announced 50 seconds ago, Remembrance Sunday events have been given the green light. The Cenotaph March Past will go ahead, but it's restricted and ticketed. Therefore, veterans wanting to pay respects in London can form up at 10:30 by Green Park Underground Station to parade down to the Royal Artillery Memorial at Hyde Park Corner. An event is going ahead. Isn't that brilliant news? It's happening. Colonel Kemp.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and I'm grateful to David Banks for passing that news on to you, because I'm also a member of the organisation that he's a member of, Veterans for Britain, which not only really tries to draw attention to the issues affecting Brexit and the armed forces, but also to the way that members of the armed forces are being so badly treated and have been very badly treated by the government in over allegations of war crimes. So the VFB, Veterans for Britain, does a great job, and they've also, I think, been very noisy, shall we say, about trying to get these events redone. So I'm grateful to him, and I'm grateful to you for the stand you took over making sure that we can remember our great fallen.
Thank you very much. And I'm hoping we can all, everybody watching on the Express Facebook page live right now on Unlocked, can we please signal boost that tweet from Veterans for Britain? Let's try and get this into a movement. Laurence Fox, our next guest, a powerful voice on social media, a true patriot. You've been doing some incredibly moving videos this week, Laurence. You started a campaign on your own social media and with the Daily Express, and we have another great announcement to make on that we can't do now. But before we get to that, Laurence, on a personal note, what does Remembrance Sunday mean to you?
Thanks very much for having me on, Martin. Remembrance Sunday to me was, I first experienced on a Welsh mountain, hillside, while waiting to go potholing, and our teacher just stopped and bowed his head in this sideways lashing rain and just stood there. He didn't ask us to or even encourage us to. He just looked at his watch and he stopped and he bowed his head, and he got more and more soaked, and I sort of observed how he did that, and I formed an interest. And then as I went to school, and I used to look down the lines of photos in what was the assembly hall in our house, and look at these school photos from 1900, well, all the way back to 1888 actually, I think were the earliest ones. And I used to think a lot of these young boys with their hope for life ahead of them and their freedom didn't know that what was going to happen to them. And so particularly stark reminder to me of these lives that were going to be snuffed out very quickly. And then I just felt duty bound. I have a lot of friends, ex-servicemen, some still serving, and I've seen guys come out of university, again, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and then go off and serve and come back and just be shadows of themselves, having witnessed, just horrible things. And I think at this time, not only do we have a duty to remember those that paid the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom, but we need the freedom to remember them. we're in a time when our freedoms are being restricted for a variety of reasons, that we must, and it's such great news that the government have acknowledged that there is a huge desire among the populace for us to be able to honour those, so that we're free to live today. So yes, and that alongside the fact that one of my grandfathers died with the shrapnel still in his neck from a German artillery shell, you know. So I had two grandfathers in the Royal Artillery. So yeah, I think it's important. I think acknowledging the traditions that and honouring those who have given so much brings us actually much closer together. It reminds us that some people very close to us died for something very important to us, which was home and this great country.
I know you took a great stand earlier this year around Land of Hope and Glory. That was due to be cancelled at the proms. It's been a testing year, hasn't it, for watching what's been happening during protests, during the lockdown, when the Churchill Memorial was first spray painted and then boxed up, and then the cenotaph, they had the flag set on fire. Do you think that, and also the greater erosion of civil liberties this year, all of those events rolled together, actually is making Remembrance Sunday this year more important than ever?
I think it's absolutely fabulous that we make Remembrance Sunday even more important every year. And we show our children what true sacrifice is, you know, that life isn't just Twitter and opinions and rights and upsetness and offence, that there was something very real that united us. And you know, as far as the people setting fire to the flag on the cenotaph, I doubt they even took GCSE history and knew what the cenotaph represented, if I'm honest, which is a sad reflection of where we are as in education. It's very important that our young people learn certainly British and European history and understand what the past is, because you know, if we don't learn from it, we're doomed to repeat it. So it's very, very important that we teach our kids as well, and I certainly have been doing that with mine.
What was your immediate and kind of visceral reaction when you heard that the government was planning to really scale back the activities on Sunday and encouraging people to stay at home? Because when I saw images of veterans in their front rooms, it filled me with a great sense of sadness that this was the alternative, and surely we should be coming together and not staying at home.
Absolutely. These ceremonies are often take place in churches or outside around war memorials, and those 2 minutes that you spend in reflection are powerful and communal. And so when I heard that the government were going to, I'm grateful that the government have decided to change their mind on this, because they realise how important it means to all generations. Freedom is important to all generations, not just those that have died in the First World War or the Second World War, also in ongoing conflicts. I'm very pleased that the government have seen sense in this area, because what's so difficult for you know, I've never served, never been brave enough, but is that to say to veterans not to do something. These are people that have been trained to follow orders, and they're also very modest people. That, you know, those that are brave enough to put their lives on the line for the rest of us tend to be quite modest, and to mandate that we had to sort of do the standard 2020 thing of just going up onto our doorsteps and clapping, I think is a dishonour to them, and it's a dishonour to the great sacrifices they've made.
I can see Colonel Kemp nodding in agreement there. I mean, Colonel Kemp, could I just switch back to you? I mean, how does it sit with your idea of what veterans stand for, to have the notion of them standing on their doorstep in a solitary manner instead of being side by side with their comrades?
Well, I think obviously the being side by side with their comrades, as Laurence rightly said, it's very important. It's very important sort of communal solidarity and appreciation of the freedom that's been won by these people who were killed. But and the reality is that this year everybody won't be able to take part that normally takes part. I think actually standing on the doorstep in silence, not clapping, but in 2 minutes silence is a very important, potentially important communal gesture, because every house in a street could have people standing outside it, which it's not the same thing, but it goes towards that communal spirit. And let's not forget as well, and it certainly isn't just veterans, there are many people who have never fought or have considered joining the forces who this means a huge amount to. Let's not forget why we have 2 minutes silence, not one. Traditionally, it's 1 minute. The reason that 2 minutes silence was introduced after the First World War was because the first minute is to honor and reflect on those who were killed. The second minute is designed to reflect on the families that were left behind, the wives, the daughters, the sons, etc., that were left behind, because they made a phenomenal sacrifice as well, incredible sacrifice, just by losing their husband or their father, or grandfather, whatever it might have been. And you know, we should be showing proper respect. Remembrance Sunday is about remembering the dead, but it's also, I think, about reflecting on and maybe expressing our private thanks for the families who also suffered enormously.
I think, Laurence, you made a brilliant point there too about the former servicemen who are still with us, who've had tremendous struggles with mental health, with addiction, through drug and alcohol abuse. I did a lot of work in suicide reduction, and there's such a tremendous crossover of servicemen. It's a national disgrace, I believe. They're not getting more help. But let's get back to the plans for Remembrance Sunday, about having march past, and attendance has just been confirmed by Veterans for Britain. That's going to happen at Hyde Park Corner. And the immediate criticism, of course, is if you're doing this, you're being irresponsible and you're risking the lives of veterans.
Who do you want to speak, Martin?
That's you, Laurence.
I think it's extremely patronizing to tell the wisest and most experienced in our society that they're not smart enough to take their own risk assessments. And I think it's part of the malaise in our society that we look to the old as, you know, vulnerable and not able to look after themselves. I mean, my father's 81 and he's the smartest man I know. I think we should allow veterans to gather together if they want to be socially distanced and careful. It's outside, isn't it? You know, wear your mask, don't wear your mask, keep your hands clean, don't, you know, all of the stuff that's important to avoid the spreading of the virus. But you know, some things, as we've been shown this last summer, some things are just too important to stay inside for.
Now, you're launching hashtag Poppy Stories on social media and via the Express. And this is, well, tell us about that. I mean, I know what it is, but you put a lovely video out launching this. Tell us about the project.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, this is before the government said that we weren't to, that we were going to sort of minimise remembrance this year. And I thought, well, hang on, there's a million stories from families across this great union about conflict, and those that they've lost, those that have had great wonderful stories that they want to share. And I thought, wouldn't it be a great idea if people sent videos in, or photos or bits of stories up onto the Express website or onto our hashtag Poppy Stories, and we could just share some of these stories and make this a week of full remembrance, so that instead of just being a damp squib of a day where people are told that they're not allowed to honour, that we could actually spend an entire week going, look at who did this. This is amazing, and we could really unearth some amazing stories from people. And you know, in a time of hopelessness, and I think hope and the desire for freedom and to respect those that have fought so hard for our freedom, I think is the most wonderful thing. So I would really encourage people, I'm going to put out some stuff tomorrow, I would really encourage people to go to your local war memorial with, you know, your uncle or your granddad or something, and get them to tell you a story, and then send it over and stick their hashtag on, and we'll share them throughout the week, and we can just unearth some amazing stories from actually the most modest and humble people in society who went away and came back different people because of what they saw and what they experienced.
I think it's a wonderful initiative, and please, if you're watching this now, make a note of it, get involved, take some pictures of your moments of celebration, and let's make this like a scrapbook of togetherness from all four corners of the UK. Let's make it. If we can't physically be together, then we can curate this, can't we, Laurence, and bring that feeling of togetherness, rallying around the central point. I think it's so important. Another thing you did, Laurence, last night, it was a wonderful rendition of a Wilfred Owen poem that you read. It's on your Twitter feed. It's now on the Express. Tell us why that poem is so special to you, and what do you think it is about poetry that has that ability to touch us about war?
Well, I think, thank you, by the way, for the compliment. I think poetry and music are very, very powerful things. And that particular poem, it's just a wonderful, it takes you right there, like any great piece of creativity. But I think what was most poignant about it for me was very obvious that Wilfred Owen had grown cynical about certain aspects of what he saw as overt patriotism, you know, having been a supporter initially of joining up, and then to think that even in spite of all of their, or despite, I never know which way around it goes, in spite of those things, he was able to put that aside, fight, and on the very, you know, his mother received his notice of his death on Armistice Day, didn't he? Died a week and a day before the end of the war, and I think what's so interesting is he had the freedom to write a poem which was very subversive and undermining in many ways of what the war effort, but he had the courage and his conviction to put his own personal feelings down on paper and get on with the job at hand. And I think that's a great and noble thing to do if you are someone who wants to be from somewhere and belong to something, which is certainly what I think. So I'm astonished by his talent and skill, and so sad that we lost him, because I'm sure he would have written some amazing poetry after.
You know, I think one of the amazing things about poetry, when I was a kind of child of the 70s, you know, my grandparents, my grandfathers served in the war. They both mercifully survived, although my grandfather's brother, Victor, didn't. He was shot down by the Luftwaffe in the final weeks of the war. But I was brought up on that kind of commando, boys' own, romanticized side of war, you know, where the Germans were always bad and the Brits were always valiant. And then as I grew up, and I also became consumed by war poetry, and Keith Douglas became someone that I really identified with. His poem, Vergesst mich nicht, is an incredible moment. He also died in the war, in the Second World War, and it tells of him finding a photograph inside the tunic of a dead German 3 weeks after they'd been vanquished in the African campaign. And it got across that moment that these guys prayed to the same God. These guys were human. They had sweethearts. They'd fallen. They'd also died. And isn't it amazing how we were fed the propaganda during the wars, but poetry had that ability to touch us in a way. And I just think poetry, war poetry, is such an incredible way of making us contemplate this. And Colonel, I can see you smiling away there. You must have some favorite war poetry too.
Well, I like Laurence, my favorite, if it is his favorite, but certainly my favorite war poet is Wilfred Owen. Absolutely incredible. I mean, there were many superb poets in the First World War and some in the Second as well. But I think, you know, Wilfred Owen, I think, rises head and shoulders above pretty much all of the others, in my humble opinion. I also think that his proposal for poppy stories is fantastic. And one of the reasons I say that is because it's so easy for many of these people who either died in the First or Second World War or more recent conflicts, Northern Ireland, Afghanistan, Iraq, the Falkland Islands, Korea, etc. It's so easy for them to just slip into history and be forgotten about. And it's so important that their names live on. And my own school, I went to a school called Colchester Grammar School. And my own school has just this week published a book of the biographies of 73 members of the school who were killed in the Second World War. They did a similar project in 2018 for the 78 who were killed in the First World War. And that school was a tiny school at the time, actually. So it was a very large number of their role. But that's so important because that book is there. People won't read it cover to cover, but they will be able to pass it on. And it means that these stories, these poppy stories, if you like, will be remembered for generations to come. And it's really, I think, vitally important that we don't just allow them to become even just names on a gravestone, but we know a little bit about them. Yeah,
and I'm the same. You know, if I see a memorial and I see 3 or 4 of the same surnames, I'm thinking, wow, you know, all of the boys in that family, they didn't make it back. And when you think about the personal impact that had on villagers and families and communities, that is why these people should never be forgotten. And Colonel, could I please implore you to help push the hashtag around on your Twitter feed, Poppy Stories. Let's get this into the veteran community. Let's really bring this together. Let's make a real push of this. For those who can't make it out there in person or don't want to go out because, hey, you know, everybody takes their own risks. Let's do this. Let's get it as a big coming together moment. Laurence, it's a brilliant initiative. Let's make it a real gathering together on the Express, on Twitter, via all of our social medias. Let's please give that a big push. Now then, every year we see people doing the same old getting offended about the poppy. And it's happened again today. It seems to be those of a certain political persuasion. Why, I'll put it to both of you, first to Laurence, why do you think it is that people get so offended by the poppy? In fact, you could say they're disgusted by it. What is that about?
I think it's fundamentally nation hating, and you know, it's built out of globalism and stuff like that. And as you say, it tends to be people with a particular argument. Unfortunately, what's so sad about it is, you know, and someone so beautifully pointed this out today on social media, that wearing a poppy is basically the same as laying some flowers at the grave of someone you loved and you lost. And I find it very difficult to understand why anybody would have a problem with that. And as you say, you know, the Oxford University said that they will never fight for king and country again, and Hitler wasn't listening. So it's down to those that do take this stuff seriously to make sure that, you know, you're totally entitled to have that view and that voice, but we'll see whose voice is heard louder. And I think ultimately good, decent-hearted people would always support solemn and decent remembrance, and those that wish to politicize remembrance do themselves actually above anybody else a great disservice.
And Colonel, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, you haven't been shy of being outspoken about this topic over the years.
I think it's growing in momentum to an extent, the sort of resistance to wearing poppies, partly as a part of the wider grievance industry that we all confront today, where people just want to oppose particularly patriotism and national feeling. And it's a way of doing that. I don't think everybody should feel obliged to wear a poppy. If you don't want to wear a poppy, you haven't got to wear a poppy. And I wouldn't ever try and shame somebody for not wearing a poppy. But at the same time, those of us who do choose to wear a poppy, there should be no possible resentment for that, no grievance against that. The one kind of dimension of this whole argument that I do have a bit of a problem with is the white poppy, which is the Peace Pledge Union's invention, which, fine, if they want to wear white poppies and have white poppies, that's all very well. But they've tried it, and they've been growing in recent years, trying to hijack it for Remembrance Sunday to get more people to buy white poppies, which go only into their own funds. The red poppy supports veterans and families. The white poppy supports only the Peace Pledge Union and their ridiculous campaign. So if they want to do it, I would argue they should do it at a different time of year, not to try and undermine and draw funds away from a really very important and valid cause. But of course, their reasoning is purely political, nothing else. And it's all part of the anti-patriotic grievance industry that we see today. Of course, people can wear white poppy, but I just think it's the way that they've orchestrated that campaign is very, very problematic.
I also think it's vitally important that things like poppy stories are out there this year. Laurence, you've tagged in the Royal British Legion this year, and all of us will have noticed there's been a huge absence of people selling poppies. I mean, I travelled into central London today. I saw a total of 4 people wearing poppies. 2 of them were black cab drivers. There's nobody selling them on the streets or at stations. It's very hard to get them even in supermarkets. Something's gone wrong with that this year. And I know, Laurence, you're greatly encouraging people to buy or to donate to the Royal British Legion. We mustn't forget their great work in all of this time. They are the standard bearers doing brilliant work. And I know, Laurence, you think very, very highly of them. So I want to wrap up now, if we could, by moving swiftly onwards, because we have you on the line, Colonel Kemp. And of course, you were a member of the COBRA committee. You've been on the Joint Intelligence Committee. You've served at the very highest level of government for 5 years, advising on terrorism. Today, it was announced in London that the UK terror alert has been raised to severe, meaning an attack is highly likely. How concerned should we be, Colonel Kemp, about this announcement today?
Well, that decision was taken by the Joint Terrorist Assessment Centre, which is part of MI5. And it basically brings our threat level up to 1 notch below the very top level. And if it got to the top level, that would mean almost certainly that the authorities had intelligence that there was going to be a terrorist attack at some time soon, or one planned anyway. I think what this means, this is a precautionary measure, I think. I don't think it's very likely to be the result of specific intelligence, but it will, I think, reflect events that have taken place, those terrible events in France and Austria that have taken place very recently, where jihadists have carried out attacks on innocent people, in one case decapitating them. And there is always a worry, I think, in across Europe, where there are tens of thousands of jihadists waiting to strike. And I'm not being over dramatic when I say that, they literally are waiting for either their decision to have a go or for the word to do so. There's always a worry that they will be encouraged to do so by other events either around the country or in other countries. And I think it's exactly that likelihood that jihadists over here could take their lead from Vienna or from Lyon or from the other places in France where we've seen recent attacks, and decide to have a go themselves. So I think it's quite right to take that precaution at this particular moment. It's obviously a threat that's always hanging over us. And one of the problems we face in this country is that we have security services, MI5 and the police in particular, and others, MI6 and GCHQ, who works tirelessly to try and keep us safe from this threat. And many, many more threats are stopped than actually turn into full-blown attacks. Some of them we read about, some of them we never know about, but they do stop a lot of these attacks. The trouble is that with the tens of thousands of jihadists that exist in this country on MI5's list, there's never going to be enough resources to deal with all of those and to ensure that we can stay safe. There are solutions to that, but to take those solutions to reduce that threat level, I think, is something that is beyond the courage of the current government, or indeed of recent governments as well, who recognise the dangers of actually taking effective action against it, and therefore are deterred from doing so.
Laurence, when you see these kinds of attacks, brutal, unprovoked attacks happening in Paris, Vienna, and potentially now London, how does that make you feel about our way of life and the threat that it obviously represents to these terrorists?
It's tragic, isn't it, to use such barbaric and medieval methods to try and force an ideology on people, and it's designed solely to terrorize people into submission. And I think that anyone who acts in that way is not acting in God's name at all. Having said that, I do think that we need to have some parity in understanding that some people are just murderous sods, and in the same way as these little idiots and horrible thugs who decide to decapitate people, there are also people that will lean out of windows in hotels in Las Vegas and shoot up country music festivals. So I think we need to be careful to separate out the act from the person. And I think we also need to do our best to have good relationships with our Muslim brothers and sisters and friends without stigmatizing them and making them feel victimized. But at the same time, you know, to avoid persecution ourselves. It's a very tricky line to walk, and I think it's, you know, it's hard, that one, but I think it's appalling. Yeah, like everyone else does.
That's well put. Could I go back to you, Colonel, and could I ask you in particular the intel you've been receiving about how have the veterans been affected by the lockdown, especially in their relationships to mental health? Is this a major issue for veterans?
Well, I think probably not much different to everybody else. I mean, I think most people in this country have been adversely affected now and will be in the future, possibly even more adversely affected by this lockdown. I don't think veterans necessarily suffer in any more severe or less severe way. I think to some extent it may be that they, because of their kind of resilience and stoicism that's been bred into them over perhaps in some cases many years of military comradeship and military training and operations, they can possibly face this sort of problem more robustly than many other people can. They've in many cases they've lived with terrible hardships for sometimes long periods of time in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. Some of the living conditions, I mean, the conditions of lockdown today make their former living conditions look pretty palatial. So I think that's I think that if anything, they're less likely to be really badly affected. But of course, it will affect them all in different ways, like the rest of humanity. I would just make one point, which I think there's too great a tendency, in my opinion, today, for people to want to brand veterans as victims. Yes, of course, there are many veterans who suffer mental health problems as a result of the experiences, as there are people who suffer mental health problems as a result of their experiences in normal life. But I think it's a very small minority that's affected. And I think mostly veterans don't look upon themselves as being victims. They look upon themselves as being effectively a band of brothers or sisters who have in many cases achieved some great things and go on after leaving the armed forces to some very, very successful careers in various different walks of life. And so I think I would say that the vast majority of veterans are not damaged by their service, they're strengthened by their service. Of course, it's important we know about and do our utmost to help the ones who are either physically or mentally damaged by their service, but I don't think in any way it's a hugely significant number of those who have served.
Good. Well, that's a positive rallying point, I think, to look towards the future now of Remembrance Sunday. The event's been announced. I, for one, will be turning out. I want to take my kids down. I think it's so important. My boy is 11, my daughter is 6. They're starting to understand what this all means now. I remember very, very clearly my mother and father explaining this to me, and they're passing on the importance, the cherished moment of Remembrance Sunday. It's gone out on social media now. The event will be there, Hyde Park Corner, the Royal Artillery Memorial, turning out 10:30 a.m. at Green Park Station. I think that's well worth attending. So a final summing up before we sign off tonight. Laurence Fox, you're greatly looking forward to Remembrance Sunday, no doubt. You're going to go along, matey?
You will definitely be finding me at Hyde Park Corner at 10:30 on Sunday morning.
Fabulous. And also, let's make sure everybody watching pushes Poppy stories around there. Colonel Kemp, I've asked you before, I'm going to ask you again. I'll ask you 3 times. I'll keep asking you. Please put this around the communities, the veterans groups on Facebook, and let's get the people to send their stories in. Colonel Kemp, final word of the show, sir, goes to you. In a nutshell, how important is Remembrance Sunday and why must it not be a victim of COVID-19 this year?
Well, I think it's so important because we do owe so much to the war dead. we owe them our way of life. If it wasn't for what they did and what they achieved and what they died for, then we wouldn't be able to live the life we enjoy today. Now, some people would argue that varying measures that have been taken by different governments have eroded some of that life, but nevertheless, we do live a very privileged life in this country, probably better than the majority of people in the world. And a lot of that is down to those people who fought and died for the country. So it is extremely important that we remember them and that we're not subdued and cowed by this virus. We should, I think, take the message and the example and the inspiration from those who had fought through and lived through 2 world wars, yet were not prepared to subdue their spirit and subdue their strength in the face of some really, in many cases, worse adversity than we are facing today or are likely to face. So yes, we should stand up. We should take part in whatever way we possibly can in the remembrance events this year.
Splendid final words. Well, if you've enjoyed what you've watched tonight, please share, subscribe, tell your friends. Unlocked are the new kids on the block. We're after the mainstream media. We're putting a new show out tomorrow, Recovery Unlocked, about an exciting new movement to push back against the punitive government COVID-19 lockdown. A big part of that is going to be turning out on Sunday. Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you for turning in tonight. Laurence Fox, leader of the Reclaim Party, also thank you for your time. I'm going to be pushing Poppy Stories hard all the way to help support you, Captain. And thank you for Daily Express viewers for tuning in. We've been Unlocked. Thank you and good night.